The wind was the first thing you knew about this place. It was a restless thing, born somewhere over the far-off mountains and given free rein across the plains of Montana. It scoured the land, flattening the wild grasses until they rippled like a great, pale ocean. It carried the scent of dust, of distant rain that never fell, and of a loneliness so vast it felt like a permanent part of the sky. In the center of this immensity stood the Rourke Ranch, a collection of sturdy, unpainted buildings that seemed to be holding their breath against the constant push of the wind. The main house was a 2-story splinter of wood against the horizon, solid and stubborn, much like the man who lived inside it. Colby Rourke was a man built to the scale of the land he worked. He was tall enough that he had to duck his head through most doorways, with shoulders wide enough to block out the sun. His hands were maps of labor, thick with calluses and cross-hatched with the white lines of old scars from wire, splinters, and the occasional kick of a stubborn mule. He moved with a heavy, deliberate slowness, as if the gravity of the earth had a stronger hold on him than on other men. And he was quiet. His silence wasn't empty. It was a solid, weighted thing that filled the rooms of his house and settled over his meals. It had driven off the last cook, a chatty widow named Mrs. Gable, who claimed the quiet was like being buried alive. After she'd packed her bags and rattled off in a hired buckboard, the silence had returned, deeper and more profound than before. For 3 weeks, Colby had lived on cold beans, jerky, and coffee thick enough to chew. The ranch was too large, the work too demanding, for him to be tied to a stove. He had a dozen hands to feed, men who worked from sunup to sundown and required hot, substantial meals to keep going. The work was falling behind. Tempers were fraying. Finally, with a grunt of resignation, he had ridden into town, his face set in a grim line. He'd hammered a small, handwritten notice onto the board outside the general store. The words were as sparse and direct as he was cook wanted. Rourke Ranch, room, board, pay, inquire at premises. Then he'd turned his horse around and ridden back into the wind. The matter done. He expected a grizzled old prospector whose luck had run out, or perhaps another widow looking for refuge. He didn't much care who it was, so long as they could handle a skillet and a 50-pound sack of flour. A week later, a weary-looking wagon appeared on the long, winding dirt track that led to the ranch. Colby saw it from the corral where he was branding a new calf. He finished the job with methodical precision, the smell of burnt hair and hide sharp in the air, before wiping his hands on his canvas trousers and walking toward the house. The wagon creaked to a halt in the yard, the single-tired horse dropping its head immediately to nibble at a stubborn tuft of grass. 2 women sat on the buckboard seat. The older one held the reins. She was a woman built of resilience, her face a testament to hard sun and harder times. But her back was straight. Her name was Bess, and her eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion, held a flicker of iron. Beside her sat her daughter, Tilda, where her mother was all sharp angles and weathered strength. Tilda was softly rounded, a sturdy girl with a quiet, placeless face that seemed to be waiting for a life to begin. She was ample, with the kind of full figure that some might call hearty and others, less kind, would call fat. She knew the words they used. She had heard them whispered her whole life. As a result, she had learned to make herself smaller than she was, to hunch her shoulders slightly and keep her gaze fixed on the toes of her worn boots, as if the ground were the only safe place to look. They climbed down, their movements stiff from the long journey. Dust coated their dark, simple dresses and clung to their hair. Bess stepped forward, leaving Tilda a half step behind her, a position the girl had occupied for as long as she could remember. Mr. Rourke. Bess's voice was clear, not loud, but it carried over the sighing of the wind. I'm Bess Cutter. This is my daughter. Tilda, we saw your notice in town. Colby's gaze flickered over them. It was not an appraising look, not in the way a man might look at a woman. It was the look of a rancher assessing livestock. He saw a worn-out mother and a large, shy daughter. He saw poverty in the careful patches on their clothes and hunger in the tight set of the older woman's jaw. He didn't see hope or fear or the quiet dignity they clung to like a threadbare shawl. "You can cook?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. He directed the question to Bess. "I've been cooking for folks my whole life," she answered simply. "And Tilda is a better baker than I am. Her bread is light as a prayer." At the mention of her name, Tilda flinched almost imperceptibly, her eyes darting up to meet Colby's for a fraction of a second before falling again. In that fleeting moment, he saw they were the color of moss after a rain, a deep and quiet green. The observation registered and was dismissed in the same instant. It was an irrelevant detail, like the color of a stone you kick from your path. "The work is hard," Colby stated, not as a warning, but as a fact. Breakfast before dawn for 12 men, a hot meal at midday, brought out to wherever they're working, supper after dusk. The house needs keeping, laundry, mending. It's not a job for one. "We're two," Bess said, her chin lifting a fraction. "And we're not afraid of work. We're afraid of starving." The honesty was as stark and unadorned as the landscape. It was a language Colby understood. He gave a short, sharp nod. He looked at their hands. Bess's were gnarled and capable. Tilda's were softer, but broad and strong. They looked like hands that could knead dough, scrub floors, and haul water. That was all he needed to know. "The pay is $10 a month, for the both of you," he said. "Room is in the back of the house. Board is what you cook. You start now. The men will be in for supper in 3 hours." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and pointed toward a small, lean-to structure at the back of the main house. "Your rooms are there. The kitchen is through this door." Bess nodded, a wave of relief so profound it was almost painful washing over her features. "Thank you, Mr. Rourke. We won't be a disappointment to you." Tilda said nothing. She just picked up a canvas bag from the back of the wagon, her knuckles white. The bag was light. It held everything they owned in the world. As she followed her mother toward the house, her stomach growled, a low, humiliating sound that she prayed only she could hear. For the first time in days, the gnawing emptiness inside her was met with a fragile spark of hope. Hope for a roof. Hope for a meal. She didn't dare hope for more. Colby watched them disappear into the house for a moment. He felt no satisfaction, no pity, no curiosity. He had a problem, and a solution had just arrived in a dusty wagon. The house, which had been silent for weeks, now had the faint sound of movement within it. He registered the change, filed it away, and turned back toward the corral. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of orange and rose. The wind picked up, whispering through the eaves of the barn. He had hired a pair of hands to run his kitchen. He didn't think about the women they were attached to. He didn't consider their past sorrows or their future dreams. In his mind, they were simply the new cooks, instruments to restore order and routine to his large, empty house. He never imagined that the scent of baking bread could change a man, or that a pair of quiet, moss-green eyes could, in time, make him question the very nature of the solitude he had built around himself like a fortress. The kitchen was a man's space, and it showed. It was large and practical, built to feed a small army, but it had no soul. A massive black iron stove, cold and silent, dominated one wall like a dormant beast. The long wooden work table was scarred with knife marks and the rings of hot pans, its surface bare and unforgiving. Shelves held utilitarian stacks of tin plates and heavy mugs, alongside sacks of flour, beans, and potatoes. The air was cold, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the water pump in the corner and the ghost of old, burned coffee. For Bess, it was a challenge. For Tilda, it was a cavern of shadows where she hoped to remain unseen. Bess, however, did not deal in shadows. She untied the strings of her bonnet and hung it on a nail by the door, the gesture as definitive as a general planting a flag on a newly conquered hill. She ran a hand over the stove's cold surface, then opened its firebox. She checked the woodpile, the kindling, the flue. Her movements were economical, born of a lifetime spent coaxing warmth and sustenance from reluctant hearths. "Tilda, child, check the larder. See what we have besides the staples," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "I'll get this fire going. A house isn't a home until the stove is breathing." Tilda nodded, her feet making soft, shuffling sounds on the wooden floorboards. She moved toward the pantry, her shoulders hunched as if to minimize the space she occupied. She was always conscious of her size, of the way the floorboards sometimes groaned beneath her weight, of the width she needed to pass through a doorway. To be unnoticed was her primary goal in any new place. The pantry was dark and cool, and for a moment, she allowed herself to lean against the shelves, the rough wood a comfort against her back. It smelled of earth and dried herbs. She found smoked hams hanging from the rafters, a side of bacon, jars of pickles, and what looked like preserved peaches. There was more here than they had seen in a year. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her. It was the breath of a person who had been holding it for a very long time. Back in the kitchen, a crackle and a pop announced Bess's success with the stove. A thin curl of smoke rose, followed by a wave of welcome heat. Bess was already working. Her hands, which had seemed so weary on the wagon, now moved with a brisk and certain energy. She found a large cast-iron pot and set it on the stove to heat, then began chopping onions and carrots with a steady, rhythmic chop-thump-chop that became the house's first new heartbeat. "There's ham, Mama," Tilda said softly, emerging from the pantry, "and bacon." "Good. We'll make a stew," Bess declared, something hot and thick to coat their ribs. "And bread. They'll be wanting bread." She glanced at the sack of flour, then at her daughter. "That's you. Tilda, show this kitchen what you can do." This was Tilda's sanctuary. Bread was a language she understood. It did not judge. It did not whisper. It only asked for warmth and patience and a gentle hand. She washed her hands at the pump, the cold water making her gasp, and then she measured out the flour. Soon, the work table was dusted white, and Tilda was lost in the familiar ritual. Her hands, which she so often tried to hide in the folds of her dress, moved with a grace and certainty that belied her shy demeanor. She worked the dough, pushing and folding, her own considerable weight giving her an advantage, her strong arms creating a smooth, elastic sphere of life. She worked in a profound silence, her head bowed, her world shrinking to the circle of flour and the growing warmth of the dough beneath her palms. She was not a cook in that moment. She was a creator, coaxing a humble miracle from flour, water, and yeast. An hour later, the house was transformed. It was no longer a wooden box sitting empty on the prairie. It was a place alive with smells. The sharp, savory scent of frying onions and ham mingled with the rich aroma of bubbling stock. But overpowering all of it was the smell of baking bread, a warm, yeasty perfume that seeped into the very timbers of the house. It was a smell of profound and simple comfort, of home. The wind, which had for so long only carried the scent of dust and loneliness, now caught this new fragrance and carried it out into the yard, toward the barns and the corrals. The ranch hands smelled it first. They were tough, weather-beaten men, not given to flights of fancy, but the scent made them pause in their work. Heads lifted, noses twitched. A low murmur went through them. They worked a little faster, their movements sharpened by a new and pleasant anticipation. Colby was in the barn, mending a harness. When the smell reached him, he stopped, his big hands still on the leather. He stood motionless for a full minute, trying to place the scent. It was bread. But it was more than that. It was a memory, distant and faint, of his own mother's kitchen from a time before the silence had set in. The scent was a trespasser, stirring something deep within him that he had long since bolted down. He felt a strange unease, a knot tightening in his chest that was not entirely unpleasant. He scowled, annoyed at the distraction, and went back to his work, pulling the stitches tighter than necessary. When the dinner bell rang, the men filed in, their usual loud, stomping entry softened by a kind of reverence. They found the long dining table set and 2 large, steaming tureens of stew placed in the center. Beside them were platters piled high with thick slices of fresh, golden-crusted bread. Bess moved around the table, filling mugs with coffee, her presence efficient and unobtrusive. Tilda remained in the kitchen, a shadow just beyond the doorway. Her job done. The men ate, for the first time in weeks. The meal was not just fuel. The silence was different. It was not the tense, hungry silence of men eating bad food. It was a contented silence, punctuated only by the scrape of spoons against tin and low grunts of appreciation. The stew was rich and flavorful, the meat tender, the vegetables soft. But it was the bread that silenced them completely. It was light, yet substantial, with a chewy crust and a soft, airy crumb that soaked up the gravy. They ate it with a focus that was almost holy. Colby sat at the head of the table, as he always did. He ate slowly, deliberately. The food was good, more than good. It filled a hollow space inside him he hadn't realized was so empty. He watched the 2 women from under his heavy brow. He saw the way Bess anticipated a man's need for more coffee, the way she moved with a quiet purpose that restored order. He was aware of Tilda, a large, still presence in the kitchen doorway, her gaze fixed on the floor. She seemed to be holding her breath, waiting for a verdict. He finished his stew and wiped the last of it from his plate with a 3rd slice of bread. He drank his coffee. The meal was over. The men started to push back from the table, their movements slow and heavy with satisfaction. One of them, a grizzled old hand named Silas, nodded toward the kitchen. "Ma'am," he said, his voice raspy, "that was the best damn stew I've had in 10 years. From the doorway, there was a slight, almost imperceptible nod from Tilda. Bess answered for them both. "Glad you enjoyed it, sir. There's more if you want it." They didn't take more, but they left the table with a new sense of ease. The usual evening grumbling and arguments were absent. They went out to the bunkhouse quietly, the simple pleasure of a good meal soothing their rough edges. Colby remained at the table. Bess began to clear the plates, but he held up a hand. "Leave it." She paused, then nodded, and retreated into the kitchen. Colby sat alone in the large room. The house was quiet again, but the silence had changed. It was no longer empty and cold. It was a warm, breathing silence, filled with the lingering scent of bread and the gentle heat from the stove. He could hear the soft clink of dishes from the kitchen as the 2 women washed up, the sound of water being poured. These were small, domestic sounds, sounds he had not heard in this house for years. They were the sounds of a place being cared for. Tilda appeared at his side. He hadn't heard her approach. She moved quietly for a large woman. She held the coffee pot, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle. She didn't speak, just tilted the pot toward his empty mug in a silent question. Her eyes were still downcast, her face turned away from him. He gave a short, curt nod. She poured the coffee, her hand steady. A wisp of steam rose between them. As she straightened up to leave, her sleeve brushed against his arm. It was a fleeting, accidental touch, nothing more than the whisper of worn fabric against his own rough shirt. But it felt strangely intimate in the vast quiet of the room. He watched her retreat back into the kitchen, a large, slow-moving shape who had somehow, in the space of a few hours, filled his house with a warmth he had forgotten existed. He sat there for a long time, sipping the hot, black coffee. He looked at the glowing embers visible through the stove grate. He felt a softening inside his chest, a subtle easing of a tension he carried so constantly, he had ceased to notice it was there. It was a feeling he couldn't put a name to. It wasn't happiness, and it wasn't contentment. Not exactly. It was a kind of quiet tenderness, a gentle thawing in a place that had been frozen for a very long time. The feeling was unfamiliar, and it made him deeply uncomfortable. He scowled into his coffee cup, telling himself it was just the satisfaction of a full belly and a problem solved. But as the wind moaned outside, he knew, on some level he was not yet ready to acknowledge, that it was more than that. The house had a heartbeat again, and he was not entirely sure what to do about it. A month settled into a rhythm. The sun rose, the stove was lit, and the house filled with the scent of coffee and frying bacon. The rhythm was dictated by work, by the seasons beginning to turn, and by the quiet, steady presence of Bess and Tilda. The ranch, which had been merely a place of labor for Colby, was slowly becoming a home again, though he would never have used that word. The change was subtle, something felt rather than seen. It was in the neatly mended tear in his work shirt, the unexpected jar of pickled beets on the supper table, and the persistent, comforting scent of baked goods that now clung to the downstairs rooms. The weekly trip into the town of Prairie Creek for supplies was a necessary disruption to this rhythm. The town was a dozen wooden buildings huddled together on the dusty plain, a place of commerce, gossip, and prying eyes. For Colby, it was an obligation. For Bess, a chance to barter for the small things the ranch didn't produce. For Tilda, it was an ordeal. She hated the town. She hated the way the boardwalks seemed to narrow when she walked on them, the way people's conversations would dip to a murmur as she passed. She felt 100 times larger in town than she did in the expansive kitchen of the ranch. Here, her size was a spectacle, a subject for quiet commentary. At the ranch, she was just Tilda, the one who made the bread. On this particular Saturday, the air was crisp with the first hint of autumn. Colby pulled the wagon to a stop in front of Henderson's General Store, the hub of Prairie Creek life. He looped the reins around the hitching post, his movements economical and sure. "I'll see to the grain order," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Get what you need from Henderson." Bess nodded, pulling her list from her apron pocket. "Come, Tilda." Inside, the store was a jumble of smell leather, coffee beans, molasses, and Mrs. Henderson's violet-scented soap. It was crowded, ranchers' wives and townswomen clustered in small groups, their heads bent together, exchanging news and speculation like currency. Tilda immediately felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She kept her eyes down, focusing on the scuffed floorboards, and followed in her mother's wake, while Bess spoke with Mr. Henderson, haggling over the price of sugar and salt. Tilda drifted toward a barrel of brightly colored ribbon, her fingers hovering just above the spools of satin and silk. It was a small, harmless pleasure to look at pretty things she would never wear. She was absorbed in the deep blue of one ribbon, the color of a twilight sky. When she heard the voices, they came from the next aisle, low and sharp, and one of them was unpleasantly familiar. It was Mrs. Gable, Colby's former cook. "Can't imagine what he's thinking," Mrs. Gable was saying, her voice thin and reedy. "Hiring that pair, it's hardly proper. Just him out there with 2 women." "Oh, I don't think he's thinking of propriety. Martha," another voice, dripping with insinuation, replied. "But still, that girl, she's substantial. A man like Colby Rourke, he could have his pick." "That's what I mean," Mrs. Gable insisted, her voice rising slightly. "He needs a cook, not a side of beef. It's a pity, is what it is. What's he want with a great hefty thing like that around the place? Maybe he hired them to eat the profits." The second woman let out a short, sharp laugh, like a hen squawk. The world seemed to stop. The bright colors of the ribbons blurred into a meaningless smear. Tilda stood perfectly still, her hand frozen in midair. The words weren't new. She had heard variations of them her entire life. Hefty, substantial. Side of beef. They were stones that had been thrown at her for so long she had built a wall inside herself to block them. But hearing them here, in this place where she had just begun to feel a fragile sense of purpose, felt different. It was a violation. The words bypassed the wall and struck something deep and vulnerable. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck, so intense it felt like a physical burn. She did not turn. She did not cry. She simply lowered her hand and stared at the floorboards, her entire being focused on not letting the women see that their arrows had found their mark. Her vision narrowed until all she could see was a single nailhead in the wood, a dark, final point in a sea of brown. Colby was at the front counter, settling his account for the 50-pound sacks of grain being loaded onto his wagon. He heard the squawk of laughter. He knew that laugh. It belonged to Clara Mae Simmons, a woman whose tongue was sharper than a skinning knife. And he recognized Mrs. Gable's thin whine. His head came up, his gaze sweeping the store until it landed on the two women. Then he saw Tilda, standing stock still by the ribbon barrel, her back to them. He couldn't see her face, but he saw the way her shoulders, which had seemed to lose some of their defensive hunch over the past month, were now drawn in tight, her posture rigid with a pain she was trying to conceal. A cold, dark anger started to smolder in his gut. It was a familiar feeling, the kind of rage that rose when a predator threatened his herd. His first instinct was to stride over there, to let his sheer size and a low, growled word be enough to silence them. His hands, resting on the counter, curled into fists so tight the knuckles went white. Mr. Henderson saw the look on his face and took an involuntary step back. But he didn't move. To step in would be to declare something. It would be to publicly draw a line, placing himself on one side and the town on the other, with Bess and Tilda under his protection. It would be an admission that they were more than just his hired cooks. It was a public stand he was not prepared to take. He was a private man, and this felt like a private shame theirs, for the cruelty of their words, and his, for his own inaction. He looked away, turning his attention back to the ledger on the counter, his jaw set like granite. He told himself it wasn't his business. He paid for their work. He gave them a roof. He wasn't responsible for their feelings. But the excuse felt hollow, and the anger, finding no outlet, turned inward, curdling into a bitter self-reproach. Bess finished her business and turned, her sharp eyes immediately finding her daughter. She saw the unnatural stillness and knew, with a mother's intuition, that something had happened. She walked over and placed a gentle hand on Tilda's arm. "We have what we need," she said softly. Tilda nodded, not looking up. She followed her mother out of the store like an automaton, her feet heavy, her gaze still fixed on the ground in front of her. The ride back to the ranch was suffocatingly quiet. The usual comfortable silence between them was gone, replaced by a tense, heavy weight. Colby clucked at the horses, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his face a thunderous mask. Bess sat straight-backed, her lips a thin, grim line, occasionally glancing at her daughter. Tilda sat huddled into herself, staring out at the endless prairie grass as it swayed and bent under the relentless wind. She saw the landscape, but she didn't perceive it. She was trapped behind the wall of her own hurt, the cruel words echoing in the vast emptiness. That evening, the supper table was a study in silence. Tilda had worked with a grim, mechanical efficiency, and the meal she and her mother produced was, as always, flawless. There was a roasted chicken, potatoes swimming in gravy, and greens from the small garden Bess had insisted on planting. But the warmth that usually filled the room was absent. The ranch hands, sensitive to atmosphere as animals are to a coming storm, ate quickly and quietly, their usual boisterous talk reduced to necessary murmurs. They finished and filed out, leaving the three of them alone at the long table. Colby ate, but he tasted nothing. The food might as well have been ash in his mouth. He was acutely aware of Tilda, sitting opposite him. She had served herself a small portion and was now pushing a single green bean around her plate with her fork. She hadn't looked at him once. She hadn't looked at anyone. Her entire focus was on the white tin plate in front of her. She stared at it as if it were the sum of her existence. The plate and the food upon it was her contribution, her purpose. It was the reason she was allowed to occupy this space. The cruel laughter in the store had stripped everything else away, reducing her to her function and her form. She was the fat girl who cooked. Her plate, filled with the evidence of her labor, seemed to mock her, a testament to the very appetite that was the source of her shame. It was a circle of quiet misery from which there was no escape. She looked at the plate, and in its simple, round, unblinking face, she saw her own worth as the world had defined it for her, and it was not very much at all. The days that followed the trip to town were shrouded in a silence thicker and more impenetrable than any that had come before. It was a silence born not of peace, but of a shared, unspoken wound. Bess worked with a fierce, protective energy, her lips pressed into a thin line, her movements sharp and precise. She spoke only when necessary. Her voice clipped. She was a fortress standing guard over her daughter's pain. Tilda moved through the house like a ghost, a large, sorrowful spirit bound to the kitchen. She performed her duties flawlessly. The bread still rose. The stews were still savory, but the heart had gone out of her work. She was a machine of flour and water and heat. She never lifted her eyes, never made a sound that wasn't essential to her tasks. The small, private world she had built within the warmth of the kitchen had been breached, and she had retreated so far into herself that she was barely there at all. Colby felt the change like a drop in barometric pressure that signals a coming storm. The house, which had just begun to feel warm and alive, was now cold again. Haunted by a quiet misery he knew he had failed to prevent. His own silence, once a comfortable habit, was now a source of torment. He replayed the scene in the general store over and over in his mind. He saw Tilda's rigid back, heard Clara Mae Simmons's cruel laugh. He felt the surge of his own anger, followed by the leaden weight of his inaction. The words he should have said were lodged in his throat, a bitter, indigestible lump. He was a man accustomed to fixing things: a broken fence, a lame horse, a leaking roof. But this was a different kind of break, a fracture of the spirit, and he had no tools to mend it. His hands, so capable of wrestling a steer to the ground or building a wall against the wind, were useless. His anger at the townswomen was a clean, hot flame, but his anger at himself was a slow, smoky fire that filled every empty space inside him. He found himself watching Tilda as she worked. He saw the profound sadness in the slump of her shoulders, the way she flinched if someone entered the kitchen too suddenly. He saw a deep and abiding hurt that he had allowed to happen. The realization that he had let her be wounded on his watch was a burr under his skin, a constant, irritating presence. The quiet tenderness he had begun to feel was now complicated by a fierce, unfamiliar protective urge that had arrived too late. One night, nearly a week after the incident, the weight of it all became unbearable. Supper had been another silent, tense affair. The men had eaten and left, and Bess had retired to their small room with a pointed, "Good night, Mr. Rourke." Leaving Tilda to finish cleaning the kitchen, Colby sat at the long dining table, ostensibly looking over some accounts in his ledger, but his eyes weren't seeing the numbers. The only light came from a single kerosene lamp on the table, casting long, dancing shadows that made the large room feel even emptier. He could hear Tilda in the kitchen, the soft scrape of a brush against a pot, the slosh of water in the basin. Each small sound seemed amplified in the profound quiet. He told himself he should go to bed. He told himself there was nothing to be said. But he didn't move. He was held there by a stubborn refusal to let the day end this way, on this same note of suffocating silence. In the kitchen, Tilda was wiping down the long wooden work table. Her movements were weary, automatic. Her arm ached with the repetitive motion, and her heart ached with a deeper, more persistent pain. The words from the store were her constant companions now, a chorus of whispers that lived in her head. Side of beef. Hefty thing. She blinked back the hot sting of tears for the 100th time that day. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her mother would see her red eyes and the fortress of Bess's anger would grow even taller. And that was a burden Tilda didn't want her to carry. So she scrubbed, pouring her misery into the simple, physical task. Her hand slipped on the wet surface. The damp cleaning rag, heavy with water, fell from her grasp and landed on the floor with a dull, wet slap. It was a small thing, but in her exhausted state, it felt like the final indignity. A sound, half sob, half frustrated sigh, escaped her lips. She bent her large frame down to retrieve it, her joints protesting. Before her fingers could reach it, a large, calloused hand entered her field of vision. It was Colby's hand. He had come into the kitchen so quietly she hadn't heard him. He picked up the rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He squeezed the excess water from it back into the bucket, his powerful fist making it look easy. Then he held it out to her. Tilda froze, still crouched, looking up at him for the first time in days. In the dim lamplight from the other room, his face was shadowed, impossible to read. All she could see was his towering form and the offered rag. She reached for it hesitantly, her own hand trembling slightly. As her fingers closed around the damp cloth, they brushed against his. His skin was rough, warm, and solid. The contact was brief, lasting no more than a second, but it sent a jolt through her, a startling current of unexpected warmth. It was a simple human touch, devoid of pity or judgment. It was just a fact, like the solid wood of the floor beneath her knees. She started to pull her hand back, but he didn't immediately let go of the rag. His fingers lingered for a fraction of a second, a light pressure that held her there. And then he spoke. His voice was low, so low it was almost a part of the shadows, a quiet rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. "You brought this house back to life." The words hung in the silence. They were simple words, plainly spoken. But to Tilda, they were as foreign and shocking as a sudden clap of thunder on a clear day. She stared at him, her mind struggling to make sense of what she had heard. People didn't say things like that to her. They spoke about her, around her, but rarely to her, and never with such a gentle, profound acknowledgement. The words didn't fit with the narrative that had been written for her by the whispers and stares of others. You brought this house back to life. He wasn't talking about her size. He wasn't talking about her appearance. He was talking about something she did, something she created. The warmth from the stove, the scent of her bread, the order and peace she and her mother had woven into the fabric of the lonely ranch house. He had seen it. He had seen her, the part of her that existed beyond her physical shell. The shock was so great it felt like a burn. The kindness in his voice was so unexpected it was painful, like light flooding into a dark room where one's eyes have grown accustomed to the gloom. She couldn't accept it. It was too much, too foreign. The wall she had built inside herself, the wall made of all the cruel words and averted gazes, was violently shaken by his quiet sentence. Her instinct, born of a lifetime of self-preservation, was to retreat. She snatched her hand away as if his touch and his words were a searing flame. The rag fell to the floor again, forgotten. She scrambled to her feet, her movements clumsy with haste, and turned away from him, presenting him with her back, her universal shield. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even breathe properly. Colby stood there for a long moment, his hand still outstretched, now empty. He watched her rigid back, the way her shoulders shook with a silent, suppressed tremor. He had said the wrong thing, or maybe he had said the right thing, and it had simply been too much. He let his hand drop to his side. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, his heavy boots echoing on the floorboards, leaving her alone with the shocking, terrifying gift of his words. The next morning, Tilda rose before the dawn, as she always did. She moved with her usual quiet efficiency, lighting the stove, setting the coffee to brew. She felt fragile, as if she were made of thin glass. Colby's words had not left her. They had settled deep inside her, a strange, warm stone in the pit of her stomach. She kept replaying the moment in her mind, the feel of his hand, the low rumble of his voice. She didn't believe him. Not really, but she couldn't forget it either. She began to make the bread. She measured the flour, the water, the yeast. She mixed the ingredients in the large wooden bowl, her hands moving with the familiar, comforting rhythm of the task. As she turned the dough out onto the floured surface of the work table, she felt the warmth of the stove on her back. She felt the solid heft of the dough beneath her palms. This was her world. This was real. And then something happened. As she pushed and folded, a sound began in her throat. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a sob. It was a note, a low, quiet hum. It was the ghost of a melody her father used to whistle, a simple, nameless tune she hadn't thought of in years. It was faint, barely audible above the whisper of the fire in the stove. It was hesitant and fragile, a thread of sound in the vast silence of the morning. But it was there. It had a shape. It was the sound of a seed, long dormant in the frozen ground of her heart, beginning, tentatively and against all odds, to sprout. The small, tentative melody that Tilda had found became a quiet companion in the weeks that followed. It was a tune she hummed under her breath while kneading dough, a soft, private sound that was hers alone. It was the audible evidence of a subtle shift within her. Colby's words, "You brought this house back to life," had not miraculously erased a lifetime of hurt, but they had planted a seed of a different possibility. The idea that she could be seen for what she did, not just what she was a fragile concept, one she was only just beginning to allow herself to consider. She still moved with a conscious effort to be small. She still kept her eyes mostly on her work, but the rigid, painful hunch in her shoulders had softened. There was a rhythm in her work now that came not just from duty, but from a budding, cautious sense of belonging. Colby noticed. He was a man who noticed the slightest change in the weather, the smallest limp in a horse. And he noticed the change in Tilda. He heard the faint humming, a sound as soft as the buzz of a bee in a distant clover field. He saw that her hands, when she set a plate before him, no longer trembled. A silent, unacknowledged conversation was taking place between them, made up of these small, quiet shifts. His one sentence, spoken in darkness, had been a stone tossed into a still, deep pond, and now he watched the ripples spread, unsure of their meaning but aware of their power. The season was turning, tipping from the long, hot days of late summer into the dry, brittle days of early autumn. The great sea of grass that surrounded the ranch had been bleached by the sun from green to a pale, shimmering gold. It was beautiful, but it was a dangerous beauty. The land was thirsty. No significant rain had fallen in 2 months. Every morning, a hot, dry wind would rise with the sun, a restless spirit that sighed through the eaves and rattled the window panes. The world was tinder dry, waiting for a spark. The spark came on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was a vast, unforgiving blue, empty of clouds. The wind was blowing hard from the south, carrying the scent of dust and baked earth. Tilda was outside, behind the kitchen, shaking out a tablecloth. The snap of the linen in the wind was a sharp, satisfying sound. Bess was inside, peeling potatoes for supper. Colby and his men were out on the far range, mending a section of fence that had been brought down by a stray buffalo herd. It was Tilda who saw it first, a thin, dark finger of smoke rising against the blue sky. Far to the south, it was barely there, a smudge of charcoal on a perfect canvas. She paused, the tablecloth held motionless in her hands, and watched. For a moment, she thought it might be a dust devil. But the smoke didn't dissipate. It thickened, darkening from gray to an angry, swirling black and beneath it, she could just make out a low, hungry line of flickering orange. The wind gusted, and the orange line leaped, growing wider. "Mama," Tilda said, her voice quiet but laced with a new urgency. She stepped back into the kitchen. "Mama, look!" Bess came to the door, wiping her hands on her apron. She followed Tilda's gaze, and a sharp, hissing breath escaped her lips. Lord have mercy. The fire was miles away, but with the wind behind it, it was moving with an unnatural speed, consuming the dry grass like a ravenous beast. It was a prairie fire, the most feared and unpredictable danger on the plains. "Ring the bell. Tilda," Bess commanded, her voice suddenly sharp as steel. "Ring it hard." The large iron bell, used to call the men in from the fields, hung from a post in the center of the yard. Tilda ran to it, her heart pounding against her ribs not with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline. She grabbed the thick rope and pulled, putting all her weight into it. The deep, clanging toll of the bell shattered the afternoon peace, a desperate, urgent cry for help that rolled out across the plains. From the distant ridge, Colby and his men saw the smoke at the same moment they heard the faint, wind-whipped sound of the bell. There was no need for orders. A shared look of grim understanding passed between them. They dropped their tools, leaped onto their horses, and spurred them into a gallop, racing the fire back toward the heart of the ranch. By the time they arrived, the yard was a scene of controlled chaos. Bess was directing the two hands who had remained behind, forming a bucket brigade from the well to the house, soaking the wooden walls and the roof. The fire was closer now, a roaring, monstrous wall of flame perhaps a mile distant. The air was thick with smoke, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs. The sound of it was a deafening roar, like 1,000 freight trains bearing down on them. Colby leapt from his horse before it had even stopped moving. "Wet the barn roof! Get the wagons and douse them!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the roar. His eyes scanned the scene, his mind working with a lightning speed. "Silas, take 2 men and start a backfire along the creek bed. It's our only chance to stop it." Then his eyes fell on the main corral, which was dangerously close to the path of the oncoming flames. The horses, smelling the smoke and hearing the roar, were going mad with terror. They galloped in frantic circles, their eyes wide and white, whinnying in panic. "The horses!" Colby roared. "We need to get them out, drive them toward the river." It was then that he saw Tilda. She was not with her mother at the house. She was standing by the water trough, a heavy horse blanket in her hands, soaking it until it was dripping wet. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair coming undone from its neat bun, but her eyes were clear and fiercely focused. "Tilda, get back to the house!" Bess screamed from the porch, her voice shrill with fear. "It's not your place." But Tilda didn't seem to hear her. For the first time in her life, she ignored her mother's command. This ranch, this house, this quiet life, it was the only place she had ever felt she had a purpose beyond just existing. The thought of it all turning to ash, of being cast out into the wind again, was more terrifying than the fire itself. She saw the panicked horses, the lifeblood of the ranch, and a primal protective instinct she never knew she possessed rose up and consumed her fear. She threw the wet blanket over her head and shoulders and ran toward the corral gate. "Tilda, no!" Colby yelled, starting toward her, but she was already there, fumbling with the heavy wooden latch. She got the gate open just as Colby and 2 other hands ran up to help. "We have to drive them out," she shouted, her voice surprisingly strong above the din. They worked together, a desperate, soot-stained team. They ran into the swirling chaos of the corral, waving their arms, shouting, trying to turn the terrified animals toward the open gate and the relative safety of the river. The heat from the fire was intense now, a physical blow. Embers, carried on the wind, rained down around them like fiery insects, hissing as they landed on the damp ground. Most of the horses, in a blind panic, thundered through the gate and galloped away from the flames. But one, a young mare Colby was training, was trapped. In her terror, she had backed into a corner of the fence, and a splintered post had collapsed. Pinning her hind leg, she screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure terror, struggling against the wood. "I'll get her," Colby yelled, moving toward the mare. Tilda was closer, without a second thought. She ran to the mare's head, grabbing the halter. "Easy, girl, easy," she soothed, her voice a low, calming murmur despite the roaring inferno around them. She used her own body to shield the mare's eyes from the sight of the approaching flames. Keeping her focus, Colby reached the trapped leg and began to heave at the heavy wooden beam. As he strained, the splintered post cracked further. Tilda, still holding the mare steady, felt a sharp, searing pain in her forearm as a long, jagged piece of wood gouged a deep furrow in her flesh. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath, but she did not let go of the halter. Finally, with a great wrenching groan, Colby freed the mare's leg. The horse, now free, scrambled away and bolted through the gate after the others. The immediate danger was over. The backfire started by Silas was taking hold, a controlled burn that was creating a black, barren firebreak. The main blaze, robbed of its fuel, would be forced to turn. The house and barns were safe. The yard was a wasteland of smoke and falling ash. The roar of the fire had diminished to a crackling rumble. Tilda stood, swaying slightly, in the middle of the now empty corral. The wet blanket had slipped from her shoulders. Her arm was bleeding freely, a dark crimson line against her soot-stained skin. The adrenaline that had fueled her began to recede, leaving behind a profound, trembling exhaustion and the sharp, throbbing pain in her arm. Colby walked toward her through the swirling haze. His face was black with soot. His shirt was scorched in several places, and he was breathing heavily. He stopped in front of her. The world seemed to fall away, the sounds of the men shouting and the fire crackling fading into a distant murmur. There was only the thick, smoky air, the gray ash falling like a gentle, hellish snow, and the two of them, standing in the ruins of the afternoon. "You're hurt," he said, his voice raspy from the smoke. She looked down at her arm as if noticing it for the first time. "It's nothing." "It is not nothing." He took her arm gently, his touch surprisingly steady. He examined the wound. It was a deep, ugly gash, filled with dirt and splinters. "Come." He led her to the water trough. The water was gray and filled with ash, but it was cool. He took a clean bandana from his pocket, dipped it in the water, and began to clean the wound, his rough, calloused fingers working with an astonishing gentleness. Tilda flinched as he cleaned the dirt away, but she stood perfectly still, allowing him to tend to her. She watched his hands, mesmerized. These were the same hands that could brand a calf, split a log, and tame a wild horse. Now, they were infinitely careful, infinitely tender, as they cleansed her injury. When the wound was clean, he took off his own larger bandana, ripped a long strip from it, and began to wrap her arm, his movements deft and practiced. The wind swirled around them, whipping strands of her hair across her face. Ash settled on their shoulders like dust. He finished tying the knot, his hands lingering on her arm for a moment longer than was necessary. He slowly lifted his head, and his eyes met hers. And for the first time, she did not look away. Her gaze, usually so guarded and downcast, was wide and direct. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were stripped of their usual gruffness and distance in the surreal, gray light, surrounded by the evidence of their shared battle. They simply looked at each other. She saw in his eyes not pity, but a raw, undisguised respect. She saw concern. She saw an emotion she couldn't name, something fierce and protective. And he, in turn, saw not the shy, large cook, but the woman who had run into the fire. He saw a strength he had never suspected and a courage that matched his own. He saw the deep moss green of her eyes, clear and steady, and in them, he saw a reflection of the same startling connection he felt himself. The moment stretched, timeless and silent, a pocket of profound stillness in the heart of the chaos. The world had been reduced to ash and smoke and the space between two pairs of eyes that had, at last, truly seen each other. The fire changed the air between them. The old silence, once heavy with unspoken hurts and awkwardness, was replaced by a new kind, one filled with a quiet, vibrating awareness. After the smoke cleared and the black scar of the burn began its slow fade back to the color of the earth, something new had taken root in the Rourke ranch house. It was a shared memory of chaos and courage, a bond forged in the heat and ash. Tilda's arm healed, leaving a pale, jagged scar that she no longer tried to hide beneath her sleeve. It was a mark, not of shame, but of a moment when she had been more than just the cook. She had been a participant, a defender of this small world that had become her own. She met Colby's eyes more often now, brief, flickering glances across the dinner table or in the kitchen. But the terror was gone. In its place was a hesitant curiosity. She had seen a man in him that day who was more than just a tall, silent rancher. She had seen a protector, someone whose hands could be both powerful and gentle. For his part, Colby found his gaze drawn to her more and more. He watched the efficient way she moved, the strength in her arms as she kneaded a massive bowl of dough, the quiet focus on her face. He saw the scar on her arm and felt a strange, proprietary pang, a mix of pride and a lingering anger at the forces that had put it there. The tenderness he had felt before was no longer a nameless, uncomfortable thing. It now had a face and a name, Tilda. He began to find excuses to be in the kitchen, to check on the wood supply for the stove, or to get a drink of water from the pump, just to be in the same space she occupied, to breathe the same air, thick with the scent of her baking. It was a clumsy, silent courtship he wasn't even aware he was conducting. When the next supply day came around, the prospect of going into town felt different. For Tilda, the old dread was still there, a knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was overlaid with a thin, fragile layer of something else. She was no longer just the cook being transported by her employer. She was a woman with a scar, riding beside the man who had cleaned her wound. It was a small, secret knowledge, but it made her sit a little straighter on the wagon seat. Prairie Creek was the same as always, a collection of false-fronted buildings baking in the autumn sun. The same clusters of people paused their conversations to watch the Rourke wagon roll to a stop. Tilda braced herself for the whispers, for the sidelong glances. "Bess, you and Tilda get what you need," Colby said, his voice the same low rumble as always, but his eyes briefly met Tilda's. "I have business at the land office." It was a lie. His business was with the blacksmith, but the land office was at the far end of the street, giving the women space. He was, in his own taciturn way, trying to shield them. Inside Henderson's general store, the atmosphere was thick with the usual smells and the low hum of gossip. Mrs. Henderson nodded a curt greeting. Tilda kept close to her mother, her senses on high alert. She was acutely aware of every lowered voice, every stifled laugh. They were by the dry goods section, Bess examining a bolt of sturdy calico, when the familiar, dreaded voice of Clara Mae Simmons cut through the air. She was standing with another woman near the pickle barrel, her back to them, but her voice was pitched to carry. "Pulled that horse out of the fire herself, they say," the other woman was saying. "More likely she scared the fire away," Clara Mae quipped and let out her sharp, bird-like laugh. "I suppose a man gets desperate, living out there all alone. It's a shame. Really, she's baked him into a stupor. I expect a man can't think straight on a full belly." She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial, venomous whisper, but one that was perfectly audible in the quiet store. "Still, you have to wonder. He'll likely take her on for good, just out of pity." I suppose she's his only choice. Poor man. The words were a physical blow. Tilda flinched, all the fragile confidence of the past weeks shattering like thin ice. The shame was immediate and overwhelming. A hot, sickening wave that washed over her, making her face burn and her hands feel cold and clumsy. His only choice. The phrase was a dagger, twisting in the deepest part of her insecurity. It implied she was a last resort, a burden to be taken on out of charity, not a person to be wanted. It negated everything: the quiet looks, the moment by the water trough, the scar on her arm. It reduced her back to a problem, a hefty thing that a desperate man might be forced to settle for. She turned to flee, to retreat into the anonymity of the wagon, of the ranch, of her own small room. But as she turned, she found her path blocked. Colby was standing there. He must have come in just moments before. He filled the doorway, a towering, silent figure, his face dark as a thundercloud. He had heard it all. His eyes were not on Clara May Simmons. They were fixed on Tilda. He saw the raw, naked pain in her face, the way the light had been extinguished from her eyes, replaced by a familiar, hunted look. He saw her shame, and in that instant, his own inaction from their last visit to town rose up and choked him with self-disgust. Not again. He would not stand by and let this happen again. A profound silence fell over the store. Everyone had seen him enter. Everyone had heard Clara May's whisper. They all held their breath, waiting for the explosion. Clara May Simmons herself turned, a smug look on her face that faltered slightly when she saw the look in Colby Rourke's eyes. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps into the store, moving to stand beside Tilda. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a wall, a fortress. He turned his head and looked directly at Clara May Simmons. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke, his words were low and clear, and they carried to every corner of the silent room. "No one's taking her," he said, the words dropping like stones into a deep well. He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, letting everyone absorb its meaning. Clara May's face went pale. Then he continued, his voice steady and resonant with a truth that seemed to surprise even himself as he said it. "But if I had the courage, I'd be the first to ask." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a stunned, breathless void. "Mr. Henderson froze with his hand in a barrel of nails. The women who had been tittering with Clara May stared, their mouths slightly agape. It was a declaration so public, so unexpected, and so profoundly personal that it left everyone speechless. He had not only defended Tilda, he had laid his own heart bare, admitting to a vulnerability, a lack of courage that no one in Prairie Creek would have ever associated with the formidable Colby Rourke. He had claimed her, not as a possession or a last resort, but as a prize he felt he wasn't yet worthy of. Tilda stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The words seemed to bypass her ears and enter directly into her soul. If I had the courage, I'd be the first to ask. It was an impossible sentence. It was a dream she had never even dared to form in the deepest, most secret part of her heart. The hot flush of shame on her cheeks was replaced by a different kind of heat, a warmth that spread from her chest outward, chasing away the cold. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. To look at him now would be too much, too overwhelming. She kept her gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. But the floor was no longer a place of refuge. It was simply the ground beneath her feet, and she felt, for the first time, that she had a right to stand on it. Colby held Clara May's gaze for another long moment, his own eyes burning with a cold fire. Then, without another word, he turned to Bess. "Get what you need," he said, his voice softer now. He placed a hand lightly on the small of Tilda's back, a brief, firm touch of reassurance and possession. "Wait for me in the wagon." He then walked to the counter, his back straight, and began to conduct his business with Mr. Henderson as if nothing had happened, leaving the rest of the store's occupants to grapple with the aftershocks of his statement. Tilda walked out of the store in a daze. The sunlight seemed brighter, the air cleaner. She climbed onto the wagon seat, her movements stiff and unreal. She didn't know what to think, what to feel. Her mind was a whirlwind of shock and a soaring, terrifying hope. The ride home was quiet, but it was a universe away from the tense, miserable silence of their last trip. It was a silence filled with the deafening echo of Colby's words. Tilda sat beside him, acutely aware of the space between them, a space that now crackled with unspoken meaning. She still didn't look at him, but she watched the prairie roll by, and she saw it differently. The endless grass didn't seem lonely anymore. It seemed full of possibility. The vast sky didn't seem empty. It seemed to be holding its breath. She kept her face turned toward the horizon, away from him. But as the miles passed, a slow, brilliant light began to dawn behind her eyes, a light so bright it seemed to illuminate her from the inside out. It was the light of a woman who had just been told, in front of the whole world, that she was not a last choice, but the first. Colby's words in the general store did not detonate. They seeped. They seeped into the silence of the wagon ride home, into the floorboards of the ranch house, and into the very air that Tilda and Colby breathed. Nothing was said of the incident. Bess, with a wisdom born of watching her daughter navigate a lifetime of small cruelties, did not pry. She simply observed the new light in Tilda's eyes, a steady, quiet flame that had replaced the hunted flicker. The men on the ranch knew nothing of the specific words spoken, but gossip traveled on the wind, and they understood that their boss had, in some public and definitive way, stood for his cooks. A new, deeper level of respect settled over their interactions with the two women. For Tilda, the world had been subtly but irrevocably reordered. His words, "If I had the courage, I'd be the first to ask," were a constant, humming presence in her mind. They were a shield against the ghosts of old whispers and a lens through which she saw everything differently. When she looked at Colby now, she saw not just a formidable employer, but a man who had confessed a vulnerability on her behalf. She saw a man who believed she was worth asking for. This knowledge was a terrifying and exhilarating burden. It demanded something of her, a response she did not know how to give. Words were not her currency. They were clumsy. Foreign objects in her mouth. Her language was flour, water, heat, and care. How could she answer such a declaration with the tools she possessed? The answer came to her a few nights later, in the quiet of the small room she shared with her mother. Bess was asleep, her breathing a soft, rhythmic whisper. Tilda sat on the edge of her cot, the moonlight painting a silver square on the rough wooden floor. She had a small sewing kit, a mending basket filled with plain thread and spare buttons, a necessity for a life of making do. In it was a small, folded square of white cotton, saved from a worn-out apron, soft from countless washings. It was clean and unadorned. She took it out, along with a needle and a spool of dark blue thread. Her hands, so strong and capable when it came to dough, felt clumsy and oversized holding the tiny needle. But she was patient. By the dim light of a single candle, she began to stitch. She was not a practiced embroiderer. Her stitches were not small or perfectly even. They were honest stitches, earnest and a little crooked, like a child's first attempt at writing. She formed one word, and then another, her brow furrowed in concentration. Each push of the needle through the soft cloth was a deliberate act, a confirmation of her own courage. The two words she stitched were the only ones that felt true, the only ones big enough to hold the immensity of her gratitude. Thank you. It was for his defense in the store. Yes, but it was for more. It was for the moment by the water trough, for the scar on her arm, for the quiet sentence he had spoken in the darkness of the kitchen. It was for seeing her. The next evening, after supper was cleared and the men had retreated to the bunkhouse, a profound quiet settled over the main room. Bess, complaining of a headache from the dry wind that had blown all day, had gone to lie down early. Colby sat at the head of the table, making notes in his ledger. The house was his again, as it had been before they came, but the silence was entirely different. It was not an empty silence, but a waiting one. Tilda came out from the kitchen. She moved with a purpose that made him look up. In her hand was the small, folded white square of cotton. She walked to the table and, without a word, placed it on the dark wood beside his hand. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't look at his face, only at the small white object sitting starkly against the grain of the table. Then she turned and retreated back into the warm, safe glow of the kitchen. Colby stared at the handkerchief for a long moment. He reached out and picked it up. The cloth was soft and worn, warm from her hand. He unfolded it. In the center, in slightly wobbly, dark blue stitches, were the two words, "Thank you." He understood. He ran his thumb over the stitches, feeling the raised thread, the earnest imperfection of her work. This was her voice. This was her answer. It was a reply to the question he hadn't truly asked, an acceptance of the sentiment he had declared. It was a bridge, built of thread and courage, across the chasm of silence that had separated them. A slow, deep warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so profound and peaceful it almost took his breath away. He folded the handkerchief carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket, placing it over his heart. He stood up and walked into the kitchen. The room was filled with steam. Tilda stood at the large sink, her back to him, her sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her arms, strong and pale in the lantern light, were submerged in the hot, soapy water as she methodically washed the supper dishes. Usually, she and her mother performed this task together, a quiet ritual of clinking plates and soft chatter. Tonight, she was alone. The pile of dirty tin plates and mugs seemed daunting, a mountain to be scaled by one person. Colby didn't say a word. He walked over to the stack of clean, wet plates sitting on the drain board. He picked up a dry flour sack towel from a hook on the wall, and he began to dry. Tilda started when she heard the soft scrape of a plate being lifted behind her. She turned her head slightly, her eyes wide. She saw him standing there, his large frame seeming to fill the cozy space, the towel in his big hands looking comically small. He was carefully, methodically wiping a tin plate, his attention fully on the task. He didn't look at her, he just worked. She turned back to the sink, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm now. She pulled another plate from the greasy water, scrubbed it with the brush, and rinsed it in the second basin of clean water. The sounds, the scrape, the splash filling the quiet room. She placed it on the drain board. A moment later, she heard it being picked up. They fell into a rhythm. Wash, rinse, place, pick up, dry, stack. No words were spoken. None were needed. The silence was not empty. It was a vessel, and it was filled with the language of shared, simple work. It was filled with the slosh of water, the soft rasp of the towel on tin, the gentle clink of a plate being added to the neat stack. It was filled with the sound of their breathing, slow and steady, a quiet counterpoint to the hissing of the lanterns. This was an intimacy more profound than any conversation. To stand side by side, sharing a domestic chore, was a quiet declaration of partnership. It was an act of profound comfort and acceptance. He was not the boss, and she was not the cook. They were just a man and a woman, working together in the warm, steamy heart of a home. Tilda washed a heavy iron skillet, her arms straining with its weight. As she lifted it to the drain board, Colby was there, his hands reaching out to take it from her, his fingers brushing against hers in the process. The touch was accidental, practical, but it sent a shock of warmth all the way up her arm. She didn't pull away. She let her fingers linger for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement, before plunging her hands back into the water. They finished the last pot. Tilda pulled the stopper from the sink, and the gray water drained away with a final, gurgling sigh. The kitchen was clean, the plates were stacked, the pots were hanging on their hooks. Everything was in its place. A deep, peaceful quiet descended. Tilda dried her hands and arms on her apron, her movements slow. Colby hung the damp towel back on its hook. For a moment, they stood in the clean, quiet kitchen, the task completed. They were only a few feet apart. He finally turned to look at her, and this time, she met his gaze. The lantern light softened the hard lines of his face and caught in the deep green of her eyes. There was no need for words. In the quiet gaze they shared, everything was said. He saw her strength, her quiet courage, her gentle heart, and she saw his respect, his steadfastness, and the tenderness he no longer tried to hide. The house was quiet. The wind had died down outside. For the first time, the world felt completely and utterly still, and they stood together in the peaceful, steady center of it. The quiet rhythm established in the kitchen that night became the new pulse of the ranch house. The silence between Tilda and Colby was no longer a void to be endured, but a space to be shared, as comfortable and familiar as the warmth from the big iron stove. Words were still scarce between them, but they were no longer necessary. A language had developed that was spoken in the way he would bring in an extra armload of firewood and stack it neatly by the stove before she had to ask, or the way she would set aside the heel of the bread for him, knowing it was the piece he liked best. These small, unspoken kindnesses were the bricks and mortar of a new reality they were building together, a structure of mutual care and quiet understanding. The landscape was changing, mirroring the transformation within the house. The last of the golden autumn grasses had given way to the stark, honest brown of late fall. The wind had a new edge to it, a sharp, cold bite that promised the coming of winter. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the world seemed to shrink, drawing all life inward toward the hearth, toward warmth and light. The ranch became a small, self-contained island in a vast, sleeping prairie, and at its center was the steady, breathing heart of the kitchen. It was in these long, dark evenings that a new ritual began. After the men were gone and Bess had retired, Colby would linger at the dining table, his ledger open but his attention elsewhere. Tilda would finish her work in the kitchen, and then, instead of immediately retreating to her own room, she would bring 2 mugs of coffee, or sometimes hot cider, and sit at the far end of the long table. Sometimes they sat for an hour in a silence that was as peaceful as a snowfall, just the 2 of them existing in the warm bubble of a lantern light. Other times, he would talk, his voice a low rumble, telling her about a stubborn calf or a patch of fence that needed mending. He spoke of the land, of the work, of the simple, hard facts of his life. And Tilda would listen, her hands wrapped around her warm mug, and for the first time in her life, she felt like a part of someone else's story. One night, the wind was particularly fierce, rattling the windows in their frames and moaning under the eaves like a lost soul. The sound made the warmth of the kitchen feel even more precious. They were sitting not at the table, but in 2 chairs pulled close to the stove, its iron belly glowing with a faint red heat. The rest of the house was dark and silent. Colby was looking into the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering light. The harsh lines softened into shadows. He had been quiet for a long time. "This house was just a place to sleep before you and your mother came," he said, his voice low, directed at the flames. "Just walls. I'd forgotten it could feel like this." His words were a simple statement of fact, but they landed in Tilda's heart with gentle force. He was giving her credit, again, for the life she had breathed back into his world. It was this quiet, steady acknowledgement from him that finally gave her the courage to voice the belief that had defined her own. She looked down at her hands, at her strong, capable fingers resting on her knees. "I was never meant for a house like this," she said, her voice so soft he had to lean slightly to hear her over the wind. "Not for my own, anyway." He turned his head to look at her. "What do you mean?" She took a slow, deep breath, gathering the courage to explain the architecture of her soul, the blueprint she had followed her entire life. "When I was a girl," she began, her voice gaining a little strength, "I knew what I was for. I was for helping. My father, he wasn't a strong man, not in body. And Mama, she was always working so hard. I was born big, and I was born strong. I could carry more water, lift heavier sacks, work longer than the other children. It was my purpose." She paused, remembering. Other girls. They were taught to sew pretty things, to arrange their hair, to learn the right things to say to a boy. They were delicate. They were being raised for courting, for loving. I was being raised to be useful. I don't think Mama ever said it outright, but we both knew. My job was to be her strength, to help her through. That was the shape of my life. She finally lifted her eyes and met his gaze. The lantern light reflected in them, making them look like deep, dark pools of water. "I think I was born just to help my mother. I wasn't born for loving." She said it without a trace of self-pity. It was a truth she had accepted so long ago it had become a part of her, like the color of her eyes or the shape of her hands. It was the fundamental law of her universe. She was a draft horse, not a show pony. Her value was in what she could carry. The idea of being cherished, of being chosen for her own sake, was a story written for other people in other books. Colby looked at her, and in that moment, he saw it all. He saw the little girl who had learned to measure her worth in sacks of flour. He saw the young woman who had stood by the ribbon barrel, her back rigid against a world of whispers. He saw the immense, uncomplaining strength she carried, and the profound, quiet loneliness that came with it. He saw the fortress she had built around her heart, a fortress constructed not of anger or pride, but of a simple, heartbreaking acceptance of a lesser fate. And a fierce, protective anger rose in him, so powerful it was like a physical force. It wasn't anger at her, but at the world that had been so blind, so small, that it had looked at this incredible woman and seen only her size. He was silent for a long, heavy moment. The wind howled outside, a perfect echo of the storm of emotion inside him. Tilda began to think she had said too much, that she had broken their comfortable quiet with her sad, plain story. She started to look away, to retreat back into herself. "Tilda," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the sound of the wind. She looked back at him. His eyes were burning with an intensity she had never seen before. "Then the world is wrong," he said. The words were not gentle. They were hard, solid, irrefutable. They were a verdict. "The world is wrong." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze holding hers, pinning her there. "You are not too much," he said, his voice dropping lower, each word carefully chosen, carefully aimed. "Other people are too little." The sentence struck the center of her fortress. It was not a gentle tap. It was a cannonball, a force of nature that hit with such precision and power that the entire structure, built over a lifetime of casual cruelties and quiet resignations, simply ceased to exist. "You are not too much." The central pillar of her identity, the belief that she was an excess, something to be apologized for and accommodated, was pulverized. "Other people are too little." The blame, which she had always carried on her own broad shoulders, was lifted and placed where it belonged on them, on their small minds, their small hearts, their inability to see. She couldn't breathe. It felt as if all the air had been punched from her lungs. She stared at him, her lips slightly parted. She felt a strange, cracking sensation deep inside her, a seismic shifting of her very foundations. The wall didn't just crumble, it turned to dust, to smoke, and was blown away by the howling of the wind, leaving her exposed, defenseless, and utterly, terrifyingly free. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped her eye and traced a slow, clean path through the faint dusting of flour on her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or of pity. It was a tear of pure, shattering release. It was the breaking of a dam that had held back a lifetime of unspoken sorrow. For the first time, she was being seen not just for what she could do, but for what she was. And what she was, he had just told her, was not an apology. It was an abundance the rest of the world was too poor to afford. She said nothing. She couldn't. There were no words for this moment. There was only the sound of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the sight of Colby Rourke's face, fierce and tender in the firelight, as he watched the fortress he had just destroyed vanish into the night. The single tear that traced a path down Tilda's cheek was followed by another, and then another. They were not the tears of a weeping girl, but the slow, heavy tears of a woman whose world had just been unmade and remade in the space of a single breath. She did not sob or make a sound. She simply sat there, letting the silent tears fall, a quiet overflow of a lifetime of held-back emotion. The fortress was gone, and she was left standing in the open, feeling the wind for the first time. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. Colby did not move. He did not try to comfort her or touch her. He sat, a bastion of stillness, and gave her the gift of his quiet presence, allowing her the space to experience the cataclysm his words had caused. He watched the tears trace their paths, and he felt not pity, but a profound, aching tenderness. He had seen the fortress she lived in from the very first day, and he had, without knowing it, been slowly dismantling it stone by stone with every small act of acknowledgement. Tonight, he had taken a sledgehammer to the foundations. He had done it because the sight of her accepting her small, cramped place in the world had become an offense to him, a blasphemy against the truth of her he had come to see. The fire in the stove popped and hissed, and the wind outside rattled a loose shutter, a lonely, percussive sound against the intense silence in the room. Tilda finally raised a hand and wiped her cheeks with the back of her wrist. The gesture was simple, practical. She took a shuddering breath that was half a sigh, half a new beginning. She looked at him, her eyes clear and luminous in the firelight, washed clean by her tears. She began, but her voice was a hoarse whisper. She had no words. What could she say? Thank you, but she had already thanked him, with her stitched handkerchief, for something far smaller. This was too big for thanks. This was a reordering of the stars. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if to say he understood. Words were not needed. They sat for a long time after that, while the fire burned down to glowing embers and the wind outside began to lose its angry voice, softening to a low, mournful sigh. The storm, both outside and in, had passed, leaving a deep, resonant calm in its wake. Finally, the chill of the room began to seep in as the stove cooled. It was late. The night had turned. Tilda was the first to move. She stood up, her joints stiff. The evening was over. It was time to return to her small room, to the familiar presence of her sleeping mother. But the path back to that room felt like a journey of 1,000 miles now. She was not the same person who had sat down in this chair. "I should," she murmured, her voice still thick with emotion, leaving the sentence unfinished. Colby stood up as well, unfolding his large frame from the chair. He was a tower of shadow against the dying glow of the fire. He walked with her as she moved out of the main room and into the short, dark hallway that led to the kitchen and, beyond it, to the small sleeping quarters she shared with Bess. The house was cold and utterly silent. Their soft footsteps on the wooden floorboards were the only sound. They reached the door to her room. This was the point where they would normally part, with a quiet nod or nothing at all. It was the boundary. But tonight, the old boundaries had been erased. She turned to face him, intending to say goodnight, but the word caught in her throat. She could only look at him, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. As she stood there, hesitant and uncertain, he lifted his hand. He didn't reach for her hand, or for her waist. He slowly, deliberately, placed his large, warm hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was a comfort, a solid, grounding presence in her newly untethered world. It was not a gesture of possession, but one of connection, a simple, irrefutable statement. "I am here. You are not alone." The warmth of his palm seeped through the thin fabric of her dress, a startling, welcome heat against her skin. He did not pull her closer. He just rested his hand there, and they stood in the darkness of the hallway, looking at each other. The faint moonlight slanting through a high window was enough to see by, painting their faces in soft shades of silver and gray. In the stillness, a universe of unspoken things passed between them. She saw the steadfast truth in his eyes, the confirmation of every word he had spoken. He saw the raw vulnerability in hers, the fear and the wonder and the dawning of a hope so new it was still fragile as a butterfly's wing. It was a look of pure recognition. Two solitary souls who had, against all odds, found their counterpart in the vast, empty wilderness. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, to retreat, but she stood her ground. This was the first choice she had ever truly made for herself, not out of duty, not out of need, but out of a simple, terrifying want. She lifted her chin slightly, a silent gesture of acceptance. Their lips met. It was not a kiss of passion or of fire. There was no desperate claiming, no breathless urgency. It was as simple and as essential as the ingredients she worked with every day. It was as honest as flour, as fundamental as salt. It was a gentle pressure, his mouth on hers, warm and firm and real. It was a kiss of acknowledgement, a quiet sealing of all the silent conversations they had ever had. It was the taste of a shared meal after a long day's work, the feeling of shelter from a storm. It was a promise, not of forever, but of now, of this moment, of this truth. It lasted only a few seconds, but in that brief, quiet contact, a new world was founded. He lifted his head, his hand still resting on her shoulder, his thumb gently stroking the line of her collarbone. They were so close she could feel the warmth of his breath, see the dark intensity in his eyes, the reality of what had just happened, of everything that had happened that night, washed over her in a wave of profound wonder. This man, who had hired her as a cook, who had seen her only as a pair of capable hands, had somehow seen his way into the very center of her. This feeling between them had not been part of the arrangement. It had not been part of anyone's plan. It had simply grown, wild and untended, like a wildflower in a forgotten corner of a field. A small, sad, wondrous thought escaped her lips in a breath of a whisper. "You never meant to love me." It was not an accusation. It was a marvel, a statement of an impossible fact. You came here for a cook. You came here for bread and stew. You never intended to find this. Colby looked down at her, and a slow, faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. A smile of such profound tenderness, it made her heart ache. He understood exactly what she meant. He had built his life on intention, on plans, on the hard, practical realities of running a ranch. He had intended to hire a cook. He had intended to have his house run efficiently. Love was not on his ledger. It was an unforeseen complication, an unexpected bounty. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers, a gesture of profound intimacy. "That's how I know it's real," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur that vibrated through her, settling deep in her bones. Because it was unplanned, because it defied logic, because it had grown in the hard, unfertile ground of their separate solitudes. It hadn't been manufactured by expectation or hope. It had simply been discovered, an unexpected treasure unearthed by the slow, steady rhythm of their shared lives. It was real precisely because it was never meant to be. The dawn that broke the next morning was unlike any that had come before. It arrived not with a sudden, sharp light, but with a slow, gentle blush of color that spread across the eastern horizon, tinting the vast, empty sky with shades of rose and pale gold. The wind, which for so long had been a restless, scouring force, was now just a soft, caressing breath. It whispered through the dry grass instead of tearing at it, carrying not the scent of dust and loneliness, but the clean, cool fragrance of the coming winter and the damp, earthy promise of the distant mountains. Tilda was standing on the front porch. She had never stood on the front porch in the morning before. Her place was in the back, in the kitchen, stoking the fire before the world was awake. But this morning, she had been drawn out into the open, into the vastness that she no longer feared. She wore her simple work dress and apron, and her hands, down to the wrists, were covered in a fine white dusting of flour. In the center of her work, she had felt the pull of the new day and had simply walked outside to meet it. She stood straight and still, her shoulders back, her head held high. She was not a woman trying to make herself smaller. She was occupying her space on the earth, solid and rooted and calm. The pale, jagged scar on her forearm was visible in the soft morning light. Not a mark of injury, but a testament, a line in the story of her life that had led to this exact moment. She looked out at the rolling prairie, at the endless expanse of land and sky, and for the first time, she felt a sense of peace with its immensity, as if she were a part of it, not just a small, lost thing within it. Colby saw her from the doorway of the barn. He had risen before dawn, as he always did, his body tuned to the rhythms of the ranch. He had gone to check on the horses, his mind still filled with the quiet wonder of the night before, with the feel of her lips, with the monumental truth of his own words. "That's how I know it's real." He had expected to smell the first hints of coffee and wood smoke from the kitchen chimney. He had not expected to see her standing on his front porch as if she owned it, as if she belonged there. He stopped, his hand on the rough wood of the barn door, and just watched her. The rising sun caught the auburn tints in her hair, creating a soft halo around her head. She was looking east, her face lifted to the coming light, and on it was an expression of such profound, quiet serenity that it made his heart ache with a feeling he could only identify as joy. This was the woman who had been born to believe she was not meant for loving. This was the woman who had been told she was too much for a world that was too small. And here she was, standing in the dawn, as magnificent and as essential as the sunrise itself. He saw not just the cook, not just the shy, large woman, but the fierce, courageous, and gentle heart he had somehow, miraculously, been allowed to discover. As if she could feel his gaze, she turned her head. Her eyes found his across the yard, across the space that separated the barn from the house, 100 yards of packed earth and sleeping dust, and she did not look away. There was no flinch, no flicker of fear, no hasty retreat of her gaze to the floorboards. She simply looked at him. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, were clear and steady, and in their depths. He saw everything. He saw the memory of their kiss, the echo of his words, and the quiet, certain dawn of a new life. And she, in turn, saw it all reflected in his own gaze, the awe, the respect, the raw, unguarded tenderness that had breached all his defenses. It was a long, silent conversation held across the quiet morning air, a conversation that confirmed everything and promised nothing, yet held the weight of a lifetime. A slow smile touched Tilda's lips. It was a real smile, not the faint, hesitant curve he had occasionally seen before, but a full, luminous expression of peace that seemed to light her from within. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He smiled back, a slow, rust-breaking smile of his own, the kind no one in Prairie Creek had ever witnessed. It was the smile of a man who had come home without ever realizing he had been away. From the open door of the house, another scent began to drift out, weaving itself into the clean morning air. It was the smell of new bread, the warm, yeasty perfume that had first signaled a change in his lonely world. It was the scent of her care, of her quiet magic. The gentle wind caught it, carrying it out to him in the barn, carrying it across the yard and over the fields. But now, it was more than the smell of a meal. It was the aroma of a new beginning. It was the fragrance of a life being built, of a house that was no longer just walls and a roof, but a home. The wind carried the scent of something growing, something real and true, in the heart of the vast and lonely prairie. Nothing more needed to be said. They both knew, with a certainty that was as solid and as real as the earth beneath their feet, that their lives had been changed, irrevocably and forever. The quiet rancher who had only meant to hire a cook, and the large, silent woman who had never expected to be loved, had found in each other an unplanned, unlikely, and profoundly true home. The story of their future was an unwritten page, but this morning, in the quiet light, with the scent of new bread on the air, they had written the first line. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We're curious. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let us know in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like, and support us further by hitting the hype button. It truly helps this story reach more listeners just like you.